There's a lot about the city that's significant to me. I'm from here, first of all, and so DC is always going to be my heart, and where my loyalties lie, and where I became the person that I am, and so for that I love it and will always love it. DC is a relatively dynamic city. It used to be called Chocolate City. It's changing now, because of gentrification and different developments that have gone on. But it has a really rich history in terms of civil rights. It has a rich history in terms of arts and even sports. And so just being a part of that and kind of growing up with that in the '90s or in the '80s and the '90s when it was relatively rough, but still you know um, dynamic, was a very kind of interesting experience. That my family were the people that really shaped me as a person. I have a really strong family unit. I have a small immediate family. I have a lot of cousins, but I have a very small immediate family. I have one brother, one sister, my dad, and my mother, and they were the people that had the initial and most significant impact on me. My family was a professional family. My father was a business consultant. My mother was an attorney, and so growing up with very strong morals, very strong values in the city, even though maybe the neighborhoods that I might have lived in or frequented because of my friends weren't necessarily the best. But I definitely had that home base where education was key. It was the number one thing in terms of priorities in the family, and also being just a good person and having that kind of willingness to help others and to be able to identify kind of wrong when you see it, and stay away from it. The things that my parents inspired me to do were to first and foremost, educate myself, and that was both in school but also uh, outside of school. I had to read books that just were not assigned. I had to, study African American history to a degree that wasn't necessarily taught, in the schools, just because they felt it was so important to know your history, know your culture. Georgetown, was, when I was coming up, was the preeminent, and still is the preeminent university in DC. And in addition to it being the preeminent university in DC and in this area, in fact, I came up at a time when Georgetown basketball, right? And this sounds odd to say, but Georgetown basketball was, the height in Black America all over the country. You would see guys in LA wearing Georgetown basketball, Georgetown, hats, shirts, sweatshirts. And so it was something that I was very proud of, being from DC, being like a Georgetown fan. And so, I wanted to kind of be a part of that, mystique. In addition to that, my mother graduated from Georgetown Law School. And so, that was something, again, that kind of fell in line for me, because I wanted to follow in her footsteps in that way. Like that, I come from a family with several lawyers. My mother's not the only lawyer in the family. Both her brother and her sister were attorneys as well. And so I saw that, admired that, and in addition to admiring, their status in the communities, and what you needed to be an attorney was something that I felt that I had, and maybe it was from having grown up in a house with an attorney, but the ability to analyze different situations, the ability to argue your point, and to make your point, to make succinct arguments, to make cogent arguments in a debate, or in a when you're asking for something, let's say. A lot of that was relatively natural to me, or it was natural to me. It was relatively easy, just because I had a lot of experience and practice with it. So I thought that it kind of would go nicely into a law career later on. So when I was in college, I was selected to do. It started out just one summer to be a summer intern as a paralegal at Arnold and Porter law firm. Is one of the largest and most prestigious law firms in the country. Really, they have offices all over the country, all over the world. And so I was an intern there for the summer, initially in my freshman year of college, and that I was able to parlay that into being able to get called back, to do it for the winters and the summers following. just because I made good impression on the attorneys that I worked for, and on Adrian Matthews, who's the paralegal coordinator for the law firm.
So what happened next?
So I was in college while I was doing that, and while I was in college working for Arnold and Porter in the summers and the winters, and going to school. Obviously, during the school year, I was doing very well in school. I had a 4.0, GPA, and was, on my way, I thought, to becoming an attorney, because, I had made, some of the connections and met some of the people that I thought, might be helpful in me getting admitted to Georgetown Law School, which is where I wanted to go. I was arrested and charged with a homicide during my second year of college that I had absolutely nothing to do with and knew nothing about. And so after that began kind of a whirlwind of experiences that I really wasn't ready for and couldn't really contemplate at the time, or contemplate fully at least. No, it absolutely was surreal getting, first of all, questioned about anything like that is a completely surreal experience to begin with, because I'd never been in any kind of trouble like that whatsoever. I wasn't, the picture perfect kid, coming up in the city, but nothing like that had ever been even mentioned along with my name, let alone me having been accused of it, or anything approaching that, as a matter of fact. And so, even being questioned was a surreal experience. Then to go from having been questioned to actually being charged, again, it was a completely surreal experience. I was in disbelief, right? And so the first levels of the grief, or the stages of grief, are described. The first one is denial. Like, I was totally separated from the reality and the gravity of the situation, just because I was so taken aback and caught off guard by the situation. And so it was surreal all the way up until the trial and through the trial, and certainly when I was convicted at the verdict stage. And I, the whole time, thought any moment they're gonna find the real person, or some movie situation is gonna unfold where some detective breaks in with, oh no, we got the right guy, and let him go. That never happened. And so I went through the trial, and ultimately I was convicted of, like I said, a crime that I had nothing to do with. So I was a person who was wrongly accused and ended up being wrongly convicted. When I was convicted, I was sentenced to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. My biggest problem and my biggest fear while I was in there was my loved ones, because I know what I'm capable of withstanding and persevering through as an individual, because I'm going through it and I know I can take this. But other people, my mother especially, my parents, my friends, and my very close friends and my family, they felt, and people don't realize that people's families go through anything with them. Illness, people talk about having to have taken care of family members when they fell ill and deteriorated. Incarceration is the same way. People's families suffer with them, and it was the most painful thing to me to see, how it affected my family, my mother especially. She's, a very sensitive person, and a mother's love for her child and her son, is boundless. And so, the pain that she felt having to know that I was in there and having to deal with that every day, and shouldn't have been, and there's nothing that she or I could do about it immediately, or maybe ever, was a very kind of harrowing experience for my father too, and for the rest of my family and friends. That was more painful to me than what I was actually experiencing personally. My dad was outside waiting in the car, and he had told me from day one, I'm gonna come get you. When they let you out, I'll be out there. I'm gonna, tell me what you want me to get you to eat, where you want to stop, all that kind of stuff. Like making plans when I legitimately had a life sentence with no possibility of parole. And I've had friends tell me since I came home that, yeah, your dad would talk about it like it was a certainty, and we would just kind of look at him like he was crazy. friends dying on the street, family. I had one of my favorite aunts, caught cancer, beat it the first time, and when it came back, she ended up succumbing to it. Things like that I wasn't home, and maybe I couldn't have done anything for her, but I could have been there for her. You know, different life occurrences just made me realize how important it was to be home with your family, and so that became my driving focus, and that was my number one priority by far. And so that was, you kind of just exist in this, what was for me, a, I'd say 9x6 cell, pretty much all the time. And there's a yard that you can go out to, but again, you're completely removed from everything you knew and everything that you've grown to love just as a human, let alone as a family person. From a friend standpoint, it's a bad situation, but more for what you've been taken from, not for what you're actively going through. You'll be fed 3 times a day, generally, and you have a semblance of a bed, right? You have what it basically amounts to a yoga mat that's the size of your body, to lay on, and that's laying across a metal slab or a stone slab. And most of the time, it was a kind of dull sense of grief, that people exist in, and that's just what people are doing. They're existing. They're not living. And so you have a facility, and because I was sentenced, because of the length of my sentence, I was placed in the maximum security institution in the whole state. Mm-hmm. So everyone in that institution had at least 20 years to do before they even saw the parole board, let alone had an opportunity to get out. And most people in there had, what they call football numbers or basketball numbers, meaning numbers akin to a basketball score, which are ranged from 30 to 100 years or 50 to however long, to one or multiple life sentences. So you are in there with a lot of people who are totally bereft of any kind of hope, and that's a unique situation. It's a very bad situation to be in, just because people feel like they have nothing to lose, and they conduct themselves that way. Whether that be through violence, whether that be through just a complete blankness and a non-caring attitude that that can actually rub off on people. There's a lot of depression, it's a negative environment in total. And that I saw guys grow old and die in that prison, and I saw guys commit suicide numerous times. They couldn't handle the stresses of it, or the weight, the gravity of what their situation was. That's just on the side of the people who are incarcerated there. Then you have the staff in the prison, who generally are, I wouldn't say all of them are vindictive, or all of them carry themselves in a negative way, but there are enough of them where it's systematic. And you have a lot of guards that mistreat inmates just because they're in a position where they have authority and there's no recourse for prisoners, really. The guards actually killed more inmates while in the time that I was there than other inmates did. And I don't think that's a unique situation in a lot of the institutions all across America, but that doesn't really get talked about. One of the things that I remember most was I was sitting and talking to a gentleman that was in his 80s, clearly. He was still lucid, but he was clearly a very old person. But I was sitting down, and we were sitting there, and, I think we might have been playing cards or chess, but we were talking back and forth, and, I was just trying to learn about him and get to know a little bit more of his story. And sitting across from a wrinkled 80-year-old man who then pulled out a picture of himself when he was 19 years old in prison, and he'd been in prison ever since. And so to see his face as a 19-year-old, in his first year in a prison, it was called Moundsville back then. The Wall is what they called it. A different prison, but the same, system. And the juxtaposition between the picture that I was looking at of a kid and seeing an old man in front of me and knowing that he had been there this whole time, and that according to my sentence that was my fate, that's what they wanted for me, that really hit me. That kind of reality is not something that's easily come by, but I will never forget it. So I became very introspective, because you have to in a situation like that, because there's no other way to turn often than inward to see, what are the depths of my strength, what are the depths of my faith, what are the depths of my ability to hope in a situation where maybe hope is not the most practical thing, it's very practical, excuse me, but we're in a situation where hope is not the most reasonable thing. um, you know I found that I was a very strong person. I found that I can handle whatever is thrown at me. I learned how to navigate crazy situations, which you often have to do in prison, and you have to think ahead so as not to, find yourself in, very precarious or even life-threatening situations. You have to outthink people, because there's, as the toughest, meanest, most violent person, there's no way you can out-strength everybody or out-violence everybody. There's always going to be two people or three or four people that are far more, violent than you, or are violent on a day when you weren't expecting it, or stronger than you, or get together to be stronger than you. So that's, not an option. It's not a viable option for the long term, and I was there for the long term. And so, having to navigate kind of an environment full of sharks and vultures and rats and snakes, taught me a lot about myself and how to conduct myself on a day-to-day basis with the dignity, still maintaining the dignity, that I wouldn't let go of, just because I knew that was not the place that I should have been, and still held on to the belief that I would someday, come home to my family and resume my life. And I had faith before then, because I was so, comfortable with Covington and the amazing team that they had on my case, that, I really had something that very few other people had, which was, a real hope, a real faith that, okay, soon I'll be out of here. Soon, my case will be overturned, my story will be heard, and, I'll be home with my family. And my attorneys were amazing the whole time, and really believed and knew that I wasn't guilty. I had my attorneys who, they're doing their job, but I had them tell me things like, I can't wait for you to meet my kids. That's not something that you say to somebody who you're just representing because it's your job. That's something you say to somebody who is innocent of what they've been accused of. And that meant a lot to me, and I think that it showed in the job that they did. And so, I was just lucky to have that. Or the initial thing that I remember most vividly about my case being overturned was the phone call that I got from one of my attorneys, Sarah Frederick, who, just told me very plainly, the decision came back and they overturned your case. And I was shocked. I was in just as much disbelief, and it was just as surreal as, at that point 10 years before, when I had been charged with the crime. And, I kind of thanked her and took a little bit of time, but that started the process of me kind of getting out. And, my father is